authorities. And I think probably there's quite a bit of emphasis on what's going on with the neighbours, whereas, you know, there's a duty to cooperate, to consider about infrastructure as well, because that's the wider, I think the gentleman over there touched on or inferred that type of thing as well. In a lot of professional circles, including economists, there's been a request to put together a public land and housing corporation, for example, probably under Homes England, to be able to deal with a lot of issues across, you know, boundaries and stuff. So I think it's just the point I'm raising about the bigger picture and the infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis. Sorry.
Mr. Matthew Good.
Thank you.
I won't keep you too long, inspectors, because I'm quite happy to cover most of the issues at future sessions. Principally, our concerns were regarding housing need and how that's been dealt with in terms of the whole HMA, which is obviously something we're going to discuss later. It does impinge on duty to cooperate, but I'm more than happy if the inspectors are happy to cover that at those sessions. Likewise, we do note through the comments that have been made at various stages throughout the duty to cooperate that whilst other authorities aren't actively objecting to what the council's saying, there is some, shall I say, passiveness about the way that they're looking at various aspects of it. And I'll use Harrogate as an example for that, with their most recent comments that the authority needs to satisfy itself that there will be no, that the test, it will meet the tests of soundness. Doesn't, to me, sound overly engaging. Doesn't, to me, sound as though there's been significant engagement so that other authorities understand and are confident that the authority is going to be having a sound plan with the evidence in front of it. We similarly note they do also raise, and I don't know why I'm picking on Harrogate, but I will do because I can see it in front of me. They similarly raise concerns regarding the longevity.
Is it because they're not here?
Possibly, I didn't know that though, so. They do raise concerns about the longevity of Greenbelt as well within this authority, which is a similar concern to which we raise.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious that there are a number of points there that the council perhaps need to consider. So perhaps if I give the council the opportunity to respond to the points that have been made.
I'll deal with some and I'll ask Mr. Slater to deal with some others. The first point that Mr. Johnson made is simply an argument that we shouldn't be allowed to use the transitional provisions, which is contrary to national policy. The idea that we should go on to a housing assessment which uses the new standard methodology is simply saying we shouldn't be going under the transitional provisions of the 2012 NPPF. And that effectively is saying we shouldn't be allowed to proceed in accordance with national policy. And Mr. Johnson's own statement seemed to me to answer his question. The fact is that the new plans that are emerging are obviously having to be dealt with under the new methodology, but as you've already said, they're still seeking to assess housing need. And there's no suggestion that that is going to increase the figures required in the HMO for York to provide. And that is being obviously kept under discussion and will be a source of liaison with Selby and the HMO, looking at the HMO generally in due course. So Mr. Johnson's point, I think, answered itself ultimately. So far as the issue of the decisions being made in isolation and not looking at the issues in the round, I think Mr. Slater would like to deal with that.
Yeah, in terms of some of the comments that Mr. Clark made, I would refer everyone to the response to the MIQs under 1.3, where it details the dialogue, for example, on transport that's been between the authority and neighbours, particularly working with Harrogate, East Riding, Selby District, North Yorkshire, and extensive discussions with Highways England on that, and that's detailed in there in terms of the issues of employment and related. Again, it's detailed, the work that has taken place with the engagement with the LEPs covering the two overlapping LEP areas. There has been extensive dialogue, not just about narrow matters, but over the wider ones, and again, it covers retail, it covers leisure, as well as historic environment, infrastructure, flood risk, green matters, renewable energy, they're all there. If I can just move on to a point that was latterly made, I think, under the duty to cooperate about other organisations and infrastructure. Again, it's in the response to the MIQs. There's reference under 1.15 there that it's well documented, our discussions at non-strategic matters, but involving healthcare, emergency services, utilities, that's gas, electricity, water and telecoms organisations. That dialogue has taken place with that, and that I think was a point that was made that we hadn't covered infrastructure. Those have all been engaged in that and it is documented. I think that was it from me, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think haven't heard from, is it Miss, sorry, it's really hard to read, I'm so sorry.
Sorry, sir, it's Ian Anderson.
Thank you, Mr.
I've
Anderson.
lived and worked in York all my life, and I suspect, looking around, I'm one of the few people who were actually here when the 1956 plan came into force. But that's irrelevant. May I ask a question? Have we got to the end of this duty to cooperate? The reason I ask that is that there's a reference to delivery of necessary infrastructure, and apart from the brief reference you've made, I don't see that that has been covered in any detail, and if not, when will it be covered? Because I would want to make a comment on that.
To answer the question, no, we haven't finished discussing the duty to cooperate, and yeah, if you wanted to make a point about infrastructure insofar as it relates to the duty to cooperate, I would strongly suggest that now is the perfect time.
I don't think it is really, because it's the sort of general thing about delivery. I'm asking, when would it be appropriate to raise questions about the delivery of infrastructure?
Do you mean in relation to the duty to cooperate? Or?
No, in relation to the plan as a whole.
Ah, okay. Yes, right. So that is something that we haven't put in the phase 1 hearings. But you can rest assured that there will be detailed questions and hearing sessions about infrastructure under the phase 2 hearings.
Yes, but the point I wish to make is that, to be blunt, I don't think this plan is deliverable. And I don't know how that wouldn't apply to the individual sites. It applies to the plan as a whole.
No, I take your point. We've had to make quite a difficult decision about how we slice the pizza,
I can
put it that way. I know that there will be other things that are very important to a plan, like, for example, as you point out, the trivial question of deliverability. But we have left that and other important matters as well to the phase 2 hearing. So we're not going to be focusing on, for example, plan viability, deliverability, infrastructure requirements and that kind of thing as part of the phase 1 hearings, except insofar as those things relate to the duty to cooperate. But in terms of the detail, what infrastructure would be needed where and when in order to deliver the plan is something that we would be looking at very closely as part of the phase 2.
So one would be able to make comments about the plan as a whole rather than just individual sites in relation to other things such as flooding and infrastructure, transport.
Yes.
Thank you.
The way that, crikey, right, the way that phase 2 is likely to be structured would be about things at a fairly high level, first of all. The provision of necessary infrastructure across the authority area. So, for example, well, are there going to be enough school places? And enough road capacity? All those kinds of things. would probably set out as separate matters to be discussed, looking at things in the round, before we then move on to the question of, right, okay, we've looked at it in the round, but what about this individual side? Does that help?
It does indeed, sir. Thank you.
So can I just assist and say that the duty to cooperate, so far as this impinges on the duty to cooperate, you've got CD20. Infrastructure is dealt with in terms of non-strategic issues, healthcare, emergency services, electricity, etc. That's pages 13 to 15. So far as transport, flood risk, and other infrastructure and energy, that's pages 98 to 103. So the operation of the duty to cooperate in respect of infrastructure matters is detailed in CD20 and the update.
Thank you very much for that. We do have 2 or 3 more people to speak. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. Just coming back on the councillor's response to my point about the transitional arrangements, I'm not saying that the council must use the standard method. It's there when we come into the discussion tomorrow. Is that what I think you'll find is that there's a degree of the safety net surrounding that number. But the reason why I raised my nameplate this time round is that there was a conversation about whether the council had considered alternatives and whether those higher alternatives would then trigger the need to look to neighbouring authorities as to whether or not those numbers had been tested. Those numbers were tested in effect up to a point in the sustainability appraisal of 2018. So my reference to that, sir, is CD 008. And if you look at paragraph 7.11 and others, it will tell you that some of those higher numbers considered actually resulted in a more sustainable result than the lower numbers did when considering the sustainability objectives of the plan overall.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Johnson. We will come on to talk about sustainability appraisal shortly in terms of meeting the requirements of that. I think we'll leave that there for the time being. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. The statement of common ground on the duty to cooperate is a very bland document. It basically, I can't take issue with the topics that are identified as cross-boundary topics, but the signatories are all officers and they all say everything is okay. There aren't any outstanding cross-boundary issues. I'm not aware, I might have missed it, but I'm not aware of any council endorsement of that approach from Selby, particularly in relation to the assertion that Selby will, in its new plan or in the old plan when it was still working towards it, meet its own housing needs. I'm not aware of that ever having been endorsed by members. And if you look at the annexes to the council's statement on the duty to cooperate, you will see under the matrix there's reference in many places to one-to-one discussions on cross-boundary issues. And I think it's important to note that most, if not all, of the discussions have been at officer level and, so far as I'm aware, have not been subsequently endorsed by the council. In relation to the links between York and Selby, there are very clear cross-boundary issues, and Mr. Johnson mentioned housing, which is obviously an important one, as is Greenbelt, and no doubt we'll come on to that at a later session. But it's important, I think, to note that Selby Town and York are only 9 miles apart, and in that gap are 3 service villages, which are all in Selby. One of them is right on the boundary of the York administrative area and is constrained by Greenbelt on 2 sides, a historic garden on the south side, Park and Garden, and an unresolved outer greenbelt boundary to the north. So that settlement, which is a settlement identified for growth, is constrained, and there have been in the past discussions between York and Selby about greenbelt boundaries and housing allocations in that area, but they've not resolved in any, they've not resulted in any positive outcome, or there is no conclusion as I see it in the documents. I think probably at this stage that's all I need to say about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps allow the council to respond to the comments that Mrs Hubbard said, mentioned there about councillor involvement, please.
With respect, she's wrong. Selby told us that the officer who signed off spoke with the lead executive member, and so the sign-off was not simply an officer decision. In any event, the sign-off only represents the end of the process, and as you've heard already, and you have in the evidence base, the discussions have been between officer and member groups on these issues. So it's only the end of the process, and one shouldn't confuse the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's with the statement of common ground with the process itself. Can I just also correct what was said a moment ago by Mr Johnson, and he referred you to the sustainability appraisal and the alternative housing figure. That is only one aspect of it he referred you to, and can I refer you, if you need to go this far, to paragraph 6.4.20 and 6.4.21 on page, no, it hasn't got a page number, 6.4.20, 6.4.21 in the sustainability appraisal, which points out the alternative housing numbers has a number of effects. Some are negative and some are positive. So it's not as if they've been ignored, they have been assessed, but it's not all one way. That was CD8, by the way, sorry.
Thank you for that. Could you just, where I find the any evidence of member sign-off on this?
That's an email I was just shown.
Yes.
I'll see what we can do to document that, but it's an email sent to our officers.
Is there
so we also have, we can get you
signatories or something like that.
We can get you minutes of the relevant member groups that have considered these notes of meetings and minutes if they aren't already submitted.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll put that information on the website.
Okay, I think we'll take comments from one more person, and I think it's probably a good time to have a little break from then. So, Mr. Keogh, please.
Thank you, sir. Just picking up on the points made by Mr. Good, I too am a bit puzzled by the apparent contradiction between some of the comments from the councils and then the statement of common ground, particularly in relation to the housing requirement. And I know I don't stray into subsequent hearing sessions, but the duty to cooperate, it's very clear in the Act, it's an ongoing, it's something that's an ongoing requirement. It's not something that's done, then stopped. And whilst the various authorities have all agreed between themselves that they will all meet their own objectively assessed housing needs, it's very clear from the figures that we've submitted and others that York has not been meeting its objectively assessed housing needs in recent years. So I'm just puzzled as to how, I'd be interested to hear what discussions have been had with the adjoining authorities as to how that has impacted on their view of the housing requirement.
Okay, thank you. Would the council like to respond to that point now, or?
I don't think we can add at the moment. We don't accept what the objectors say. We'll deal with any consequential issues on that in the OAN session.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Keogh. Okay, I think at that point we will take a break. It's 11:45 now. Perhaps if we take 15 minutes. So if we reconvene at 12 noon, please, and then we'll resume the hearing then. Thank you very much.